The plane dipped through a quilt of gray clouds and leveled over a country that looked from the small oval window like the basalt bones of something ancient sleeping under a cold sky. Lila Hart pressed her earbuds in, but the playlist she'd built for inspiration, Sibelius, a smattering of Sigur Rós, a folk singer who wrote about fjords without ever having seen one, felt tinny compared to the silence on the other side of the glass. She had come to Iceland for quiet, also for a deadline. The Berlin Festival had given her 6 months to write a new work, and she had spent the first 3 peeling songs off her skin like old stickers and finding nothing underneath. Take space, her agent had said, where nobody knows you. The whisper of a residency had become a concrete invitation. A little cottage on the Snæfellsnes Peninsula with a stove, a desk, a mattress that pretended not to remember other bodies. She arrived in late October as the light wore thin, and even the sheep moved like punctuation marks on an otherwise blank page. The cottage sat on a spit of lava rock, reduced by time to gravel and grit. The nearest town, Hellesandur, offered a grocery that smelled of bread diesel and wet wool. The landlord, a woman named Aileen with a braid heavy as a rope, met Lila with a key and a warning the wind came from all directions and might steal doors if you forgot to latch them. "You are from Los Angeles?" she asked, as if Lila had admitted to living underwater. "You will need sweaters." That first night, the wind scolded the eaves, while Lila unpacked her small Life laptop, thick staff paper with treble clefs already printed, like promises. A battered violin her grandfather had pawned and then redeemed by fixing radiators through 2 winters. A cassette recorder because sometimes tape caught ghosts her phone could not. The radiator knocked, the kettle whistled, the horizon went from slate to ink. And then under everything she heard it a violin. Not hers. Not on the earbuds. Not the memory of anything she'd loved. It came faintly at first, a thread pulled through damp fabric slipping in and out of the wind. Lila stood very still. The phrase rose and turned, not quite a melody, more like a coastline seen from a plane, jagged, unfinished, inevitable. She went to the door and braced it open. The wind grabbed her hair and flung salt at her face. The sound was clearer outside, the notes pulling toward the beach, as if they had a spine of iron and the tide was a magnet. She followed. The moon had not yet lifted. The dark was complete except for the slurry of stars that made her dizzy when she looked too long. Her boots sank into black sand. The sea licked at the shore in long, patient breaths. And there on a shoal, slick as a bone under the water, stood a figure. She could not say later how she knew he was not human. It wasn't the way the water curved around his ankles without swallowing him, or the halo that wasn't light, but the color of something remembered. It wasn't even the instrument he held, which, God help her, was a violin made of things that should not have made music, fishbone for ribs, amber for varnish, a fingerboard black as obsidian. It was the way the notes came out of him like exhalations he'd been holding for centuries. He turned his head and looked at her. It was a small movement, no more than a flinch, but the music faltered as if a wave had broken across it. "Hello," Lila said, because when faced with a myth, the only language she had left was the ordinary. He lifted the bow, and the next phrase swallowed her name. She didn't want to run. It occurred to Lila that most sensible people meeting a creature who stood on the sea and bowed a skeleton violin would turn and flee to the nearest lock and electricity. She stayed. The piece he played wrung out the swell of the tide, tugged at a memory she couldn't place. The melody landed on a minor third and hung there as if undecided whether to fall. She realized she was weeping when the wind salted her tears. When he stopped, the silence rang. He tilted his head, curious. His hair clung to his forehead in wet ropes. His eyes were the pale, sea-washed gray of driftwood. He wore a shirt that might once have been linen and was now the color of fog cuffs dark with water. She tried to find a word for him that wasn't siren or ghost. The closest she had was the word her grandmother had used for fairy, when Lila was small Yu-Tun creature of wonder and warning in the same breath. But Vietnamese words felt like a prayer she didn't own. She said instead, "Who are you?" He smiled slightly, like someone trying on a face he hadn't used in a while. When he spoke, his voice was low and woven with a grain like drift sand. "Rune," he said, "if you need a name. What else would I use?" She thought of asking if there were more of him, if he was alone in being extraordinary. Instead, she stuck out her hand the way she would with a human musician she was about to duet with. "I'm Lila." He looked at her hand as if it were a shell presented by a child. Then he set the bow against the strings and played a single sustained note. It vibrated in her bones. She realized he had said her name that way exactly. This was how he spoke in tone and interval in attack and decay. When he wanted to ask a question, the bow lifted and she felt the question in her blood. "Do you understand me?" she tried, embarrassed to sing her reply, as if she were in an opera where logic took the night off. The sound that emerged was small and human. "Yes," she said. "I think I do." Something loosened in his face. The tide nosed higher as if it had noticed someone standing on it and was politely planning to claim him back. He took 2 steps toward her over water that deepened into a wash of phosphorescent blue, as if it grinned underfoot, and stopped when the sea made a line at the edge of the sand. The shore was a border. It said, "Not yours." He bowed again, a courtesy from another century. "Why are you here?" Lila asked. "Why now?" He drew the bow across the strings in a gesture that tasted like iron and old rules. He did not need language to tell a story. The story came the way storms did all at once. She saw brief images, a red moon swollen like a wound lifted above a horizon of slate. A boy's hands on a boat rope. A woman with hair full of seaweed, her mouth a cold seam. A court under the surface where eyes burned and scales flashed. A promise made aloud that cost him the sky. The images were not in order. They weren't even all his. But the pattern settled into meaning. "You can only come up when the moon is red," she said. He nodded a small tilt. Another long note, this one threaded with a rhythm that felt like a clock counting only 2 hours out of a year. "How many nights?" He splayed his fingers on the violin's ribs, 1, 2. Then he held out both hands, 10. Then he folded 3. She counted 17. She was about to ask if he meant 17 nights or hours, when he played a quick sliding figure that tasted of urgency and edges. She understood 17 hours in total, scattered across the weeks, when the blood moon visits twice. "Who bound you?" she asked. "The mothers," he said without saying it. The cord he built had weight and teeth, a matriarchal music, heavy as the belly of a whale. "Can you be freed?" At that, his mouth did something that wasn't a smile, and wasn't resignation either. He lifted the violin under his chin and played a phrase that seemed to ask her, "Can you write a note that stops the tide?" "I can try," Lila said, and meant it, and was terrified by the part of herself that thrilled at the idea. He raised his bow in farewell, as gracious as a curtain call. "Tomorrow?" she asked. He nodded. Then he walked away over the water until the dark folded him. She stood on the sand until her hands went numb, thinking you should have recorded that. But the tape would not have caught what mattered. The music was already inside her, a problem that felt like a promise. Back in the cottage, she opened the window to the cold and set her violin on her shoulder. The bones of Rune's theme were there hidden in the angles of the wind. She found the minor third and the question that hung there. She found the counterline that wanted to answer and didn't. She wrote until the kettle had boiled itself dry and the page took the ink like skin taking breath. Sleep came like a truce. She dreamed of red light in water. Days narrowed into the kind of daylight that is more agreement than illumination. Lila walked the shoreline at low tide with her cassette recorder catching sounds. Her phone sanitized the skitter of tiny stones as a wave pulled away the soft collapse of kelp, the hollow vowel of wind in a driftwood rib. She visited the tiny library, where a volunteer stamped due dates into books nobody seemed in a rush to return. The shelves held sagas that read like ledgers, names and feuds, and winter after winter. In a corner she found a pamphlet printed 30 years ago on a copier that had believed in ghosts. It spoke of Huldefolk, the hidden people, and of laws that had moved roads in deference to rocks, where someone once had heard singing. At the grocery, a woman in a sweater the color of lichen asked what Lila was writing. A sonata, Lila said, because it made the project seem manageable. The woman nodded. The sea is louder here, she said, as if that were an index of genre. Later, over coffee, sweet enough to pull her teeth, Lila asked Eileen, the landlord, if anyone had ever played music on the water. Sometimes Eileen said, "The sea plays the long instruments. The shore plays the short ones." She considered Lila over the rim of her mug. You should not fall in love with anything that can outlive you. Sound outlives everything, Lila said before she could stop herself. Eileen shrugged as if conceding a point to a student who would learn another thing later the hard way. At night, when the sky grew thin with a copper yoke of moon, Lila went to the beach. Sometimes Rune came. Sometimes something in the dark warned her away with a taste of iron and the whisper of her name in a voice that wasn't human. When he did come, he stood at the water's edge and played his half-sentences. They constructed a grammar together. She would hum a question. He would turn it upside down and make it mean a different question entirely. She learned how he said yes, a perfect fifth clean as a fishbone, and how he said no, a tritone salt bitter. His laughter when it came sounded like a bow hair snapping. It made her want to cry. "Why did they bind you?" she asked one night, when the moon was a nail and the frost in the grass sang underfoot. He played a drone that felt like a procession, then a melody that was a child's, naive and sure. Then the drone sharpened, sprouted fins. He had been too curious, he showed her. He had followed a melody into a place he had been told not to go. He had asked a question of the wrong listener. The mothers had answered with rules. The price for the joy of surfaces would be the loss of them. Only when the sky bled could he borrow a body that breathed. "What will free you?" she asked. He looked out past her head toward the line where the dark made a promise to be beached by morning. He played a figure that climbed and did not resolve stopping a breath before it should, leaving silence at the top like an unstruck bell. She knew what he meant, because she had been trying to write it since she was 19, a melody so inevitable it erased its own alternatives. A piece that did what myth asked of prayer, closed a door without slamming. It ended without ending. He needed a perfect cadence, not in the key, in the heart. At the cottage, Lila built a ritual. She would boil water, place her palms over the steam, to thaw the stiffness out of the knuckles her teacher had promised were too short for a real career. Then test the piano's grudging middle register. She wrote in pencil because ink lied about the permanence of decisions. She taped measures to the window when they felt right, let the wind threaten them, watched which ones clung. Her violin sat on the table like a companion who knew her worst stories and did not judge them. When she played it, she felt a crack that had opened in her years ago soften at the edges. That crack had started the day her father had laid the pawn ticket on the table like a death notice. "Just for a little while, kid," he'd said, and smiled the way men do when they cover a wound with a joke. He'd gotten the instrument back eventually, his hands burned from radiator pipes, and the tips of his fingers seared to smooth coins, but the sound had changed, warmer worn. He had died during a march that smelled like wet cardboard. She had played at his funeral with a bow hair that snapped on the last chord, and whapped her chin with a sting like a reprimand. Music had been a country. Grief had redrawn its borders. Here the borders shifted again, but gently. She tried endings. She wrote 3 that were beautiful and wrong. She wrote one that made her think of her mother's voice on an answering machine and tore it up so hard she left pencil gray under her nails. She went to the beach and told Rune she was failing him. He lifted his bow, set it down across the strings without moving. The note did not sound. It was a silence with structure. "You're patient," she said. He played a note that meant I have had practice. On the first night the moon climbed full and rusted, the wind died. The sea lay like a seal's back shining under its own breath. Aileen, who measured days by practicalities, stopped by the cottage at dusk to deliver a coil of rope and a warning about slippery rocks. "People go out when the moon looks like blood," she said. "They always think the light is for them. It isn't." "It might be tonight," Lila said, surprising herself. Aileen rolled her eyes heavenward as if petitioning a minor god for patience. "Tie your phone to your wrist," she said, "and if you hear your name spoken from behind, you do not turn." Lila tied the phone to her wrist. She did not plan to answer it. The idea of anyone else's voice in the dark felt like a violation of genre. The beach was not empty. 2 teenagers with backpacks shared a cigarette that smelled of mint and bravado, passing it back and forth as if rationing courage. A man with a camera on a tripod planted his feet and made shutter noises that sounded like small birds dying. Lila chose a cove she had not tried before, a bit of coastline shaped like a cupped hand, where the rock smoothed water into a table. He was there. This time when he looked at her, recognition moved through his face without hurry. He lifted the violin, and she lifted hers, and for a moment they stood absurdly, a woman in boots and a myth in fog light, about to count in a duet. She did not count. She put her instrument down and stepped as close to the line as she dared. "I have a draft," she said. She had copied it out neatly on good paper, as if neatness were a charm. You'll have to hear it to know if it—" Words were flat here. She felt clumsy in them. He gestured with the tip of his bow, a flourish that meant play. She did. The piece began as the night had with air turning its face toward water. She'd written the opening in harmonics, a thin glass sound that suggested an instrument remembered its own past life as a bottle. Then the melody, the minor third, his question bent up, then down, never quite landing where it would be comfortable. The tempo was the seas. The bow strokes were spare, the rests loaded like traps. She'd stolen a rhythm from the library radiator and braided it into a drone. When she reached the place where endings go, she didn't. She went to the edge and leaned. "You are building a bridge out of breath," she thought, "and the wind is a vandal." It came close. Close enough that when she lifted her bow from the string, the silence carried on the shape of her line for a heartbeat before it collapsed. Rune breathed out as if he'd been holding air in a decade. He nodded once, twice. Then he played back her last 4 measures, turned inside out, ending on a note that hung like a lantern and refused to go out. The note was not perfect. It might be a keyhole. "I need the key," she said. He put the bow hair at the corner of his mouth for a second. as if tasting it. Then he did something he'd never done before. He stepped back. Water climbed his calves. He lifted his violin and placed it impossibly on the surface of the sea. It did not sink. It floated as if the varnish were oil turning so the moonlight found the thin amber of its back. He laid the bow beside it. Then he stepped forward again until his toes touched the sand and the rules said, "Stop." He spread his empty hands. The gesture was simple choose. "What am I choosing?" she asked, but she knew. The melody could be perfect, but only if she paid a price exactly the size of her certainty. The mothers did not deal in discounts. He did not answer in music or otherwise, and she understood that too. The choice would ruin him if he hoped. Lila picked her instrument up again with fingers that felt too large. She set the chin rest against her jaw. She lifted the bow. The memory rose like a fish. It was the sharp-hooked kind that caught you in the mouth even if you tried to spit it out. Her father's hands around a coffee cup, the pawn ticket, the funeral cord, the cracked bow hair like a small, obedient serpent. The first time she'd heard her own work played by someone else and felt both love and jealousy burn the same place in her. The night a man she thought she might marry told her he admired her ambition almost as much as he feared it. The body knows what the mind refuses. She felt which memory the sea wanted. "No," she said aloud to no one and everyone. "Not that." The moon climbed indifferent. She tried instead to offer her failures. An audition in a windowless room where all three judges had the same bored expression. An email that began, "We're going in another direction." The cheap, immediate righteousness of a fight won because the other person loved you more. The sea was not interested. She tried to offer her fear. The sea yawned. She looked at Rune at his empty hands. What made the cadence perfect was not cleverness. It was surrender to inevitability. The sea did not want her sorrow. It wanted her certainty. The knowledge she carried like a lantern inside her ribcage, the one that had kept her from writing endings because she could not stand to admit that something once begun might become complete. The memory that made her an artist because it broke her open every time she touched it. Her father's face when he listened. Not at the recital, not at the funeral. In the kitchen a Tuesday when she was 10 and playing scales with a new seriousness, and he turned from the sink with his hands soapy, and the look on his face made her understand that love could be fierce without being loud. That look had built a house in her. She kept tea there. She kept the good paper. The sea wanted it. Rune's eyes were not gray now. They were the color of the inside of an oyster, filmed with a luminance that did not come from the moon. He shook his head once, not at her at the demand. Lila brought the bow to the string. The first note sounded like breath picked up and shaped into a line. She stepped into the cadence. She gave the sea the look on her father's face. It left her with precision, as if someone had used tweezers. The bar of music that followed was both easier and harder. Easier because something stopped fighting harder, because she could hear the loss like a high frequency riding the melody. She ended on the chord the piece had demanded since the day it was born in the wind. The chord closed like a door. For a heartbeat, nothing moved. Then the violin bobbing on the water spun as if a hand had slapped it. It slid toward the shore without making a ripple, as if drawn on an invisible string. Rune took a step forward and held very still as if he had been told an animal will approach if he pretends to be a tree. The instrument reached the line where water grew shy of land and stopped. He bent and lifted it, and let his palm rest for a second on the place where a human violin has a heart. He looked at Lila. The gratitude in that look hurt more than any price. He came every night after that until the red drained from the moon and winter shouldered the light. He could stand with his ankles in the sea until the water turned his calves the color of marble. He could not step onto the sand. They spoke in phrases. She brought her violin and the tape recorder she never turned on. He brought a way of hearing that taught her to leave what did not need to be said unsaid. He told her once of the mothers who had bound him. He did not make them villains. The music he used to name them was substantial. It had a thrum like a boat's engine filtered through whalebone. They had made rules because rules keep young creatures from dissolving. "And you?" she asked. He answered with a quick, impish figure that made her think of a boy knocking the cap off a bottle of soda just to see the fizz. "You'll get yourself killed," she said, smiling. The smile faded. "Will this," she gestured at the night, the line, the terrible, beautiful demarcation, "kill you?" He played a soft, neutral interval that translated to "not if it doesn't have to." She wanted to ask what he would do if freed. He played before she could a sequence that sketched a person standing in a doorway and tasting snow. The line was so human it made her bones ache. She did not ask the other question, the one that had started to seed itself in places she didn't illuminate. "If you are freed, do you stay?" When the moon finally paled and the night went blunt, he came and shook his head before she could woo. He played 2 notes, flat and tired. Enough. 17 hours counted. The next time would be months away. He set the fishbone violin against his hip and looked at her as if to memorize something. She laughed because the alternative would have been to weep and said, "Remember my worst joke, not my best face." He'd learned the shape of laughter. It felt different when he mirrored it. "Take this," she said impulsively, before rules could object. She went rummaging in pockets and brought out a narrow strip of staff paper. On it in pencil was the cadence, the last 4 measures that had bent the night. "If you forget," she said, "this will remind you how it felt." He did not try to take it. He held his palm out flat, and she set the paper on it. He let the tide swell under his hand until the water lifted the paper and took it apart gently, fiber by fiber. He hadn't needed to say why. Nothing from the shore stayed whole under the surface. The price of holding it was too high. He played a note that meant "I know it" without paper now. Then he was gone. Lila slept with the curtain open and woke when dawn pushed a gray shoulder against the window. She made coffee so strong her tongue went numb and stared at the empty place where the cadence should have sat easy in her. The shape of the chord was still there, but it slid off the hook of memory like a fish that knows more than you do. She could not recall her father's face in the kitchen. She knew the outline, the sink, the soap, the cup, but when she tried to focus on the look that had built a house in her, she saw only a clean pane of glass. She cried a little. It felt perfunctory and honest. Then she went to the piano and played the chord and felt something like a door open in a room she hadn't realized was locked. The piece was better. She hated that. She loved it. She wrote through the short days and ate soup from a pot that never quite emptied. Berlin emailed twice. The first message was polite alarm. The second made the word contract heavier than paper should bear. She replied to both with attachments and a sentence that felt like a person at the bottom of a well calling up that the rope was fine, actually. Eileen stopped by with rye bread still warm from a darker oven than Lila owned, and a choice she delivered as if she were talking about tractors. "You can go home for the holidays and eat overcooked turkey," she said, "or you can stay and pretend the year was on purpose." "I'll stay," Lila said. The truth was she could not imagine sharing mouth heat at a table with anyone who believed daylight obeyed clocks. "Bring back the spoon," Eileen said, as if Lila had not just admitted to needing the island like a drug. On the day the sky decided it had had enough, and threw snow sideways until everything was a smudge, Lila sat at the window and copied the sonata clean. She titled it Blood Moon. Then, because sentimentality makes cowards, and she wanted to fight like a decent soldier, she crossed that out and wrote Rune. Berlin liked the piece. Berlin liked the piece in the way that makes you forgive cities for putting prices on feelings. The premiere sold out in a week. A violinist named Daria, whose attacks were crisp, and whose hair made newspaper men write adjectives they would be ashamed of, in other contexts sent Lila a voicemail in which she screamed happily and then apologized for screaming. "It sits under the hands like something that was always under the hands," Daria said. "But it hurts. In a good way." "Don't play the ending until you have to," Lila said. "Save it for when the room deserves it." She practiced saying the dedication out loud for R. It made the air thicken, and she did it anyway. She wanted to put his name on a program to make ink hold what water had loaned her. She did not write him a letter he would never read. She did not talk to Aileen about him except once when she asked whether the mothers ever changed their minds. Sometimes Aileen said when someone sings them something they have not heard before. It was a non-answer dressed as folklore. It was all Lila had. She counted the months. In February, the moon would redden again briefly, as if embarrassed by its own drama. She stayed on the peninsula because leaving felt like cutting a thread, and she wanted the thread to hold. She taught herself how to make a stew that tasted like it had been cooking for a lifetime. She learned the names of winds from a man at the harbor who believed wind was a moral category. She slept less and dreamed more. The night the moon blushed as promised, the cold was a knife that had been recently sharpened. The teenagers with cigarette courage had aged into someone else's town by then. The photographer had likely found a different place where light made promises it could not keep. Lila walked the familiar path with her violin case bumping her thigh. He was there. The relief was baseline like salt in blood. He looked thinner, as if the months without body ate muscle. She smiled and could not stop. "Listen," she said, and played him the whole piece start to stitched finish. She did not look up to see whether he approved. The approval of a myth was too dangerous a drug. She needed to keep her pulse slow enough to do the work. When she finished, the silence jumped once as if something under it had kicked. Then he played back the cadence slower than she had written it, peeling each note like fruit. The chord landed and stayed lit. It was not the perfect cadence that freed anything. It was the way grief had been made into a lighthouse without denying it was also a room with no windows. Behind Rune, the water lifted. At first, Lila thought it was a swell in polite conversation. Then she saw eyes. They opened like coins. The surface bulged without breaking a dome that was also a face if you knew how to look at faces that were not yours. She heard a music too low for human ears and felt it in her molars. It made a language of pressure. The mothers. Rune turned, and the tilt of his head was the same as the first night, a courtesy offered to an impossible guest. He played 3 notes, not a plea, not a boast. He played. Lila realized with a humor so dry it cracked the beginning of her piece as if to say, "See what we made. See how even rules can be turned into a loom." The water answered. It did not sound like forgiveness. Forgiveness is a human invention. It sounded like adjustment. The dome lowered unbulging, and for a moment the tide retreated farther than it should, exposing rocks slick with algae and a small stunned crab that held its claws up as if trying to catch snow. Then the sea rushed back and drew a new line. Rune looked down. The line was a foot closer to land than it had been. A laugh ripped out of Lila. It sounded like it belonged to a creature that had been living in her ribs for months and was suddenly given sky. They changed the rule, she said between almost sobs. They moved the edge. He stepped forward and put both feet on sand. The world did not end. It rearranged. It made room. He stood there on dirt that would become mud if he lingered and closed his eyes. The gesture was not dramatic. It was simply a man saying grace. He opened them again and looked at her in a way that made the night soft around the edges. "You're here," she said, idiotic with joy. He stepped again. He was close enough that she could see the cut at the corner of his mouth, where a winter had chapped him, despite his absence from air. He lifted his hand slow enough to contradict fear and touched the wood of her violin, where her shoulder had polished it to a satiny shine. His finger hovered for a second over the place where human instruments keep their heart. He did not touch her, not yet. "Is it forever?" she asked, "because humans love contracts." He didn't answer. He looked over his shoulder at the water. The line looked back, patient. He took another step and swayed as if gravity had chosen him suddenly and rudely. She caught his elbow. The joy in her body sharpened into something brighter and more dangerous. "We don't have to decide anything tonight," she said. "We can just walk." They did. They walked the small distance a border had given them. He watched her face while she watched his feet, as if both were miracles that required supervision. He stood on a rock and looked toward the mountain, as if height was a concept he'd owned once and was trying to remember how to wear. She wanted to show him street lamps and coffee steam and the way scarves take human heat and hang on to it like secrets. She wanted to show him a radiator and the burn scars it gave and the warmth that made those scars a fair trade. She wanted more than was wise to show him what morning did to glass. Before dawn, the line tugged at them. It was not a voice. It was a fact. He stepped backward until his heels kissed foam. He looked at her then in a way that would have made a younger version of her break and a harder version look away. She did not look away. This was the cost of borders, and the gift of them you knew when you were crossing, and you knew when you were not. "Tomorrow," she said. He lifted his bow and played the interval that meant yes. It shivered in the new air and felt like a promise that a person had made, not a myth. The days that followed laid boards over the gap between ocean and land. Not literal boards. That would have displeased the mothers. They laid them in ritual the walk at night. The soup steaming. The page that took the pencil line as if grateful for the wait. Rune learned streets slowly, like a foreigner who refused to be rude. He did not like closed doors and stood in front of them until Lila understood and opened them. He drank coffee and made a face of betrayal. He preferred hot water, which felt to him like a sea tamed for hands. He learned to put on a sweater without making it into a battle. He watched the kettle boil with the reverence of a pilgrim in front of a shrine. He did not live on land. He visited. That was the rule now. It did not hurt to accept it. It did not hurt. Once he stood in front of the piano and touched a key and flinched at the way a hammer pretends to be a fingertip. He shook his head, smiling. Then he looked at her violin and played on the fishbone instrument, a scale that made the air stand taller. She felt the echo of her father and did not have the picture. She had the shape of the room. It was enough, it was not. She learned to live inside that sentence. When Berlin wrote again, it was to ask for the score to be posted online for rehearsals. She sent it with a note that read simply, "Dedicated to R." Daria, the glittering, sent a photo of the first page on a music stand, lit by the thin lamp that makes practice into religion. "I will not break it," Daria wrote. "I will carry it the way one carries a bowl of broth. Lila believed her. She sent separately a scanned image of 4 measures and tried not to imagine the paper submerging and becoming fiber. She didn't need to. The cadence lived in the hands of multiple people now. That was another kind of myth reproducibility as incantation. On a night when the moon was ordinary and the wind forgot to be cruel, Lila and Rune sat on the beach just above the new line. They did not touch because sometimes the lack of it made the conversation larger. He asked in the way he had that rising forth that meant, "Tell me something I cannot read in your face," what frightened her most. She thought of honest answers and gave one, that I will write the thing I was supposed to write, and then spend the rest of my life standing next to it, explaining. He nodded, as if she had said hunger. He played a fragment that sounded like a fish learning to breathe. "And you?" she asked. He moved the bow along the string without pressing. The whisper of hair against gut was softer than grief and as present. He played a figure that touched the notes of her name and stopped where the kitchen memory would have lived. Then he dropped to the low register and built a chord that felt like being held under water and learning, embarrassed but victorious, that you can hold your breath longer than your last attempt taught you. When he let the bow go, the night offered them a sound that was not theirs. A seal's cough, a gull complaining about fish economies, a distant generator in need of mercy. Life sampling itself. "What do you want?" she asked too quickly, then wished she had waited. The rules were clear about wanting. But the question was in the air now and had its own gravity. He did not play. He said in words as if trying them on against teeth and tongue, to stay. The voice was low and careful. He looked startled by it, as if sound in this form were a trick he'd learned penniless from a generous street magician. He cleared his throat and tried again. To stay and not fade. Lila felt her blood come and go. Stay how she asked, because human brains are buildings made for scaffolding. He looked at the sea. The line can move, he said, not as hope but as geology. If we sing again, will the mothers allow it? They listen, he said. He smiled in a way that made her imagine a boy putting an ear hose to a railroad track. Sometimes they are bored. She laughed out sorrow's small splinter and leaned back on her hands. Then we'll give them something they've never heard. The premiere happened in a city where people walked quickly for warmth and purpose, and where the hall's acoustics had been tuned by a man who thought of sound as a person with a taste for mushrooms and wood. Lila wore a black dress that admitted to being a uniform, hugged Daria, whose hair was a comet, and sat in a seat where she could see the soloist's right hand. When the first harmonic rang, the room held its breath in the universal mammalian way people do when stories begin. She heard across the stretch of a continent a tide's patient hands. When Daria reached the cadence, the audience made a sound that was not clapping. It was a caught breath, a communal intake, the body's collective understanding that some doors are meant to close so others can open. After a man with a program rolled into a blunt sword, wept into it, and looked unembarrassed. Lila shook hands and answered questions about structure with sincerity. She thanked the second oboist for the way he had been exactly a shade more present than the score demanded. She did not say the word mothers. She did not say the name she had written as R. It was not secrecy. It was respect. Back on the peninsula, the moon leaned toward redness again, as if reluctantly. This time, Lila wasn't scared of the price. She had paid it, and found that the currency of grief refills without your permission, but also without your guilt. She and Rune stood at the line and tuned. He did not bring his fishbone violin. He carried nothing. She stood with empty hands, too. The sound they made would use other instruments, the throat, the ribs, the space between them. The sea heaved itself into the shape of attention. The mothers did not show eyes this time. They showed weather. The wind sharpened, then softened, then stilled in a sequence that made harmony out of air. Lila and Rune sang not syllables but vowels with edges. They braided the cadence into the line and let it unspool. They did not ask. They did not beg. They showed. The line moved. It was not dramatic. It was not a miracle in the sense that miracles make headlines and convert cynics. It was a courtesy. It slid a foot, and then another, as if a hostess had noticed guests needed room for their elbows. The water withdrew and left a rock bare that had never been naked in Lila's time there, a rock that caught the moon and held it in a shallow bowl. Rune stepped. Sand held him. He moved forward again and did not sway. His balance had agreed to be mortal. He looked at Lila. The look was simple. "Are we doing this?" She stepped toward him, closing the distance like an ending that had the decency to admit it was also a beginning. He lifted a hand. She put her cheek in the cup of it. His palm was neither cold nor warm. It was a temperature you could live at. They stood there while the sea considered ambition and decided not to scold it. "Stay," she said. "For as long as we can," he said. His voice was clearer now, as if practice had tuned a muscle, then longer in the ways that matter. Morning came. It came like it always does in places that have earned it through agreeing an agreement, a thin mile of light laid carefully on the floor of the world. They walked back to the cottage. The kettle learned his name. He sat at the piano bench and put his hand on the closed lid and closed his eyes the way people do when putting a hand on a living thing's flank. She set out bowls. Steam lifted. When he tasted the soup, he did the small private smile that meant to both of them the world can be survived and maybe loved. On the table lay a copy of the score with its dedication. He touched the R lightly, the way one touches a name carved on a stone, not as grief, but as acknowledgement of labor. "You made the door," he said. "We opened it," she said. Outside, the sea breathed. It would outlive them. The music would outlive them too, but not the way the sea did. It would outlive them in rooms where people made soup after, in hands that learned and forgot and learned again, in a chord that knew where to land and taught strangers how to listen for it in their own lives. That night, when the tide pushed like a stubborn child and the moon bled politely, they went to the beach and drew a staff in the sand with a stick. They wrote notes on it with their heels. The water came and erased the notation, but left the rhythm. The wet sand held the pulse like a drumhead. Lila laughed. Rune laughed. Somewhere under everything, a mother's choir rolled their eyes at being moved by a trick they had seen for centuries, and being bored no longer allowed it to stand. When Lila dreamed later, she stood in a kitchen she knew was hers because her hands moved without thought. Water ran. A cup waited. She turned, and the face she looked for was not there. The absence did not gut her. The absence was the shape of a room inside which music hung like steam. She woke smiling, not at peace. Peace is the wrong size for the human body, but oriented. The kettle called. The wind decided for once not to be cruel. On the shore, the tide drew a line and held it. For now, for long enough. They went out in the morning and practiced staying.